I would just like to request everyone to put their mobile phones on silent for the smooth conduction of the seminar. And at the end of the session, we also highly encourage it, but we'll be having a Q&A session. So feel free to ask as many questions as you want. Uh, Dear all, good evening. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome you on the behalf of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune, for the special session under our Thursday seminar series. Why is this special? Because we have our very own Samruddha Surana, a second year student of MSc Economics at GIPE, who will be presenting his research on India's liberalization policy, re-examine, and he will give a new take on this liberalization policy. So we are really honored to have our student be presenting here, and as his friend and also as the MC for today, I take great pride in introducing him, and I request him to come to the podium to start his presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Devaparna, and the folks have chosen to be here and listen to me today. Um, right. So, as Devaparna mentioned, I am going to be talking about some research. I should mention that this is ongoing research, right? So, this is, and the reason I'm presenting is to maybe get some more ideas on. So, we have some ideas on how we want to proceed with this research, and if anybody has any thoughts on that, we'd really welcome that. Okay, so this is a project that my co-author, Dr. Malcolm Scott King at Ursinus College in the US, and I are working on. Um, and it's titled Crisis and Anti-Leviathan, India's Liberalization Re-Examined, right? So moving on. Um, the first is setting up the research question, right? Now I don't need to talk about this very much, at least in the Indian context, which is the importance of the 1991 reforms. And I say that in the sense that not with any value judgment here, but just to we recognize that these were momentous, right? That the 1991 reforms, the period after that, led to the greatest poverty reduction the nation's ever seen in a period of time. It also led to increased farm productivity, and there were just such important structural changes that happened during this period, and especially this 1 year, right, 1991. And the reforms continued after that as well throughout the 1990s. And later, there's some debate on how reforms slowed down, but that's not really the concern right now. The concern is with the fact that 1991 was a momentous year. And again, for this crowd, I don't need to harp on that point very, very much. And because it's such a momentous and important year, we believe that it's important to understand what led to these reforms, right? From a political economy perspective, because it's such a huge structural change, what led to it, right? There's quite a bit of research there. There's quite a bit of research on what happened after the reforms. Did it make a change? Was it good? Was it bad? But there's not a lot of research on what led to it itself, right? So that's something we want to ask and try and answer. Now, what we do is we study the influence of ideas and ideology on the 1991 reforms, and I'll talk a little bit. I mean, this is what the presentation is about really. So essentially, the importance of ideas and ideology on economic policy and institutions has already been quite well studied, right? So we have Ed Lopez and Layton in 2012 in their book Academic Scribblers, Madmen, and Intellectuals. They demonstrate how political entrepreneurs can use ideas to affect policy change, right? So they use examples of research like airline deregulation in the US and how the politicians responsible for bringing that about, how they use like political entrepreneurship to bring it about, right? Because you have to do it through the democratic process. There's a lot of log rolling, there's votes involved, trading votes and favors. But essentially, it traces back to the ideas that, hey, this change is important. We need to deregulate airlines, right? They take 4 different case studies. This is one of them. Second, Danny Roderick in 2014, he argues that ideological explanations are de-emphasized relative to interest-based ones, right? So when we talk about change, there are broadly three I's of explaining change. One is ideas, the other is interests, and the third is institutions, right? So it could be like there was institutional change, and that's that's what led to the change, or there is interest group, right? So there are different interest groups that are interacting with each other, and that the interaction of these interest groups led to the change. Now this is something that we could think about in like the voting process. There are different interest groups involved. They trade favors through the voting process and everything, and that's one way of explaining it. But what Danny Roderick found was, and this is the point he was making, that ideology and idea based explanations of change are de-emphasized, right? They're de-emphasized both as the explanations themselves and also in academia, in economic, political economy, literature, to study the influence. And to give you a quick glimpse into why that is the case, and this is also why I wanted to present here and get some thoughts, is essentially because how do you show, how do you test for a change in ideas and ideology and the resulting change, right? You can look at interest groups, you can identify interests, right? You can look at institutions, you can look at the rule structures, you can identify how institutions would incentivize particular kinds of behavior and how that change would happen. But it's difficult to do that with ideas, right? Because ideas are something we carry in our heads, right? So how does that happen? That's what we're going to talk about as well today. Um, Lastly, another bunch of literature talks. So Deirdre McCloskey and Joel Mokyr, they talk about the importance of ideas in leading to the Industrial Revolution, right? So we all know the hockey stick diagram. That is until 1800s, more or less, the world per capita GDP was stagnant. It was just flat, right? But in 1800, it starts picking up at a very rapid pace. Now, for the long, humans have been here for many millennia now, right? Why is it that economic growth is a phenomenon of only last 200 years? It's a very short period of time. It's less than a blink of an eye when we look at the entire human civilization, right? So why did it happen in just in 1800s? We know this period as the Industrial Revolution, of course, right? Now, McCloskey and Mokyr argue that this was a result of importance of ideas, right? They argue that the Enlightenment ideas, which is what made it possible to have these institutions, to have, in one sense, the work ethic, in other sense, things like patent rights that give you more incentive, things like give more trading, more exchange, um, more organization in the form of firms, that allowed these changes to sort of happen. And ideas were important in this sense, right? The idea that we can create entities like corporations, and these can be used as channels for our investments. So this is the explanation that they provide, and they explain it as an historical accident, right? They don't explain it that the Western Europeans were better than the rest of the world, and that's why it happened. They know it's for them, it's purely a historical accident that these ideas came there, and these ideas were sort of implemented, and that's what led to these the Industrial Revolution. My co-author and I, we claim that ideological change, along with the 1991 balance of payments crisis, was a necessary component for reform, right? Why is this important? The 1991, the crisis itself, there are two elements, right, for a change to happen, and with the question itself. One is the timing of the reforms, right? Why 1991, right? The second question is the direction of the reforms, right? The reforms could have very well gone in the other directions, that we could have had more state control, we could have more government control, right? Why is it that it went in the direction of less control? And why did that happen in 1991? These are the two important questions. And we believe that ideological change, along with 1991, the balance of payments crisis, both of these together answer the question. So a quick roadmap of what we're trying to do in this research. First, we provide a brief background on the evolution of political economy in India since its independence and the 1991 reforms. Then I will quickly introduce some existing explanations of the 1991 reforms and why there is some unsatisfaction with them, right? Which is they explain quite a bit, but they also leave quite a bit unexplained. The third is that we briefly sketch Higgs framework. Robert Higgs is the framework that we are building this research upon, and that was the motivation for our question. And we look at other frameworks that we plan to use in explaining the 1991 reforms. And we don't evidence that we could be using, right, that we plan to use for our research to document this ideological change and to show how this ideological change led to the reforms. And finally, I will conclude. Okay, so again, I don't need to give a lot of background here, but I'll quickly go over this, which is in pre-independence India. So we all know that when India became independent, it adopted central planning and the socialist pattern of society as the means to organize the economy, right? But even in pre-independent India, in the 1930s and 1940s, where we had all the freedom fighters and people who wanted an independent country, they were already thinking about, hey, when we become independent, how do we plan our society, right? So M.N. Roy's People's Plan, the Bombay Plan, Nehru's plan of 1930s, all of these plans were, plans for what India will do after independence. But all of these advocated for a very strong role of the state in the economy. Why is that? Again, here, ideology plays a very important role, which is you look at markets and private players with some apprehension. Why is that the case? Because the ones who colonized us was a corporation, right? It began with a corporation. So there's already that distrust of private corporations sort of coming into the picture, right? And there's an ideological pattern there, because it's this idea that private corporations are bad, right? And that idea is important. But even after it became independent, we adopted the socialist pattern of society, yes, and central planning in the 1950s. Nehru, okay, again, with Nehru himself, Jawaharlal Nehru was the first prime minister. He was influenced by ideas of Fabian socialism that he was introduced to when he was in London. And like, what was Fabian socialism? So socialism is about a society where it's not a democratic society, right? Socialism is a society where you have more authoritarian regimes, but there's no private property, so the state will decide how to allocate resources. But there's also no democracy. It's more of an authoritarian regime. Now, Nehru was a liberal in one sense, right? And he was liberal in the sense that he wanted democracy, right? And that's where the Fabian socialist idea comes from. That is, we will have democracy and central planning, right? So we will have political liberty, but we will not allow economic liberty, right? So we have political and personal liberty, which is Nehru was also very much in favor of personal liberty. That is, people should be allowed to practice whatever the religion they want to, and not just Nehru, right? The broader thing, the broader Constituent Assembly also at the point of time. So they believed in all of this, but they believe that economic liberty is not the way to go, right? So the way India started out was being influenced by Fabian socialist ideas, right? With a deep distrust of markets and private corporations. And then the second 5-year plan, again, that was designed by PC Mahalanobis, was based on a modified Soviet model, right? Now, again, this is an import of not just technology, but of ideas, right? That this model, so one, that we want to plan an economy, and second, we want to do it on a central planning sort of model, on a Soviet model. So the planning exercise is not just like a technology exercise, that this is how we want to plan our economy, but the fact that you want to plan an economy, right? That itself is also, and there's an ideological component there. Right. So in 1991, I'm moving ahead a little bit, but we had a balance of payments crisis. We are all aware India did not have enough foreign reserves to even import 2 to 3 weeks of, 2 to 3 weeks of oil, and oil is extremely necessary to keep the country running. And so during this crisis, around the months of June and July, PV Narasimha Rao, who was again in a bit of an unstable coalition government, right? He, along with other ministers and bureaucrats, they initiated economic reforms, liberalizing the economy. When I say liberalizing the economy, I mean in 3 distinct ways. Some reforms are listed here. Just a quick note, which is not all of these happened in 1991 exactly. They were gradually implemented over a period of time, right? So it was not as much like a shock therapy that all of these will be implemented. It was gradual, right? but there were deep structural changes that were happening. So there, in the sense of we have trade policy reforms, which is import licensing removal. The tariffs were reduced, so the median tariff on imports was something like 150%. That fell down to less than 50%. Within industrial policy, there was an abolition of industrial licensing, right? So a lot of industries pre 1991, again, if you wanted to start an industry, you needed a license to start it, right? Any kind of industry, more or less. But in 1991, except for eight sectors, industries in all the other sectors were delicensed, right? So if you want to start an industry, you can start the industry. You don't need the government permission to do that anymore. And then fiscal and monetary reforms, which is a reduction in fiscal deficit and a decontrol of interest rates by the Reserve Bank of India. And then service sector reform, which is a greater um, openness to foreign equity investment and opening up the insurance sector to private players. Again, this is later 1998 that the insurance industry was opened up. But also things like current account liberalization, right? You opened up the current account, you were not controlling the exchange rates anymore. That is again a part of the reforms. Okay. So now we look at some of the existing explanations of the reforms, like I mentioned, and why we find them a bit unsatisfactory. The first is interest-based explanations, right? So we discussed this interest, institutions, and ideology. So let's first look at interest-based explanations. So Bardhan, 1998, when he talks about the political economy of development in India, he he writes that the liberalization occurred because there has certainly been an increase in the lead up to the liberalization in diversity, fluidity, and fragmentation in the coalition of dominant interest groups. So, according to Bardhan, pre 1991, there were some certain strong coalition interest groups, right, who clearly dominated the scene, such as particular industrial houses and rich farmers and bureaucrats. And because it was in these three interest groups' interest to have more barriers to entry, so that their position does not get dislodged, that's why we had a strong role for the state, right? And there was no markets were not allowed to operate. And he writes that in 1991 these coalition groups got dislodged, and that's why the reforms happened. And Jenkins 1999 Jenkins wrote that Rob Jenkins at the LSE, he wrote that opportunities opened up to personally or to build networks of patronage by steering benefits to political supporters, which is again the idea that politicians had an incentive. Now, okay, his explanation is now there are different interest groups that are coming up, right? So the ASOCHAM and FICCI, these were the established business houses, but now CII was coming up. CII were these new industries which contain like Infosys and other IT industries, and they wanted more openness, right? The earlier established industries like the steel industry and the cement industry, they did not want to open up the economy. So that's an interest group based explanation. Now, one issue here is that it does not explain the timing. Okay, we understand that there was a sudden break in 1991, that there was a crisis, right? But why did this crisis lead to this dislodging of interests in this particular direction? There's no explanation for that, right? So all of these the interest group coalitions, they were happening through the late 1970s and late 1980s as well, right? The Shetkari Sangathan movement had took a lot of momentum in 1980s, and these were not rich farmers, they wanted freer markets, right? But why is it that why did 1991, what was the reason there, right? That this theory does not explain that well enough. Second are institutional explanations, which is reforms happened because the IMF and World Bank imposed conditionalities upon India when we had to borrow from them to tide out the crisis. But there are some issues, right? First, research has found that compliance with IMF conditionalities is very low. It's less than 40%, right? So just the fact that somebody's imposed conditionalities upon you for a loan does not mean that you will comply with them. Okay, and in 1966, India faced a similar balance of payments crisis. In early 1980s, India had similar balance of payments issues. Even then, the IMF and World Bank tried to get India to implement these reforms. They didn't do it then, right? So did they suddenly become more amenable to it in 1991? Not necessarily the case, right? Like that itself cannot be an explanation. And the reform ideas were getting in place before the conditionalities. So, for instance, Montag Singh Ahluwalia, he wrote something called the M document in 1990, where he had already charted down the path for reforms, right? So now India didn't have to wait for IMF and World Bank to give like these are the reforms we want you to implement. India had them in place, right? So when in the moment of the crisis, within a couple of weeks, they had to come up with completely structural changes. It's not like they had to sit down and go to the drawing room and then come up with this plan. No, these plans existed, right? These ideas existed there. So again, this just saying that IMF and World Bank impose conditionalities does not explain it. The third explanation is that disappointing growth spurred the change. Now, this comes from economists like T. N. Srinivasan and Kassanan Joshi at Oxford, which is the fact that until now we had centrally planned socialist economy did not show growth, right? That's a fact. And because now they were dissatisfied with the growth, that's why we had the change, right? Again, on one level, it does not explain the timing. 1960s, again, these problems were identified. They identified that we are not meeting our planning targets, right? And if you're not meeting your planning targets, then there's a reason to go back to the drawing board and come up with this. But they didn't come up with these changes then, right? So this itself again is not, these explanations do explain the reforms, right? But like I said, there's some gap that's missing, which is about the timing and the directions of the reforms. And you recognize that even if you take all of these three together, they still don't do the job, right? Moving on. So what we rely on is the book Crisis and Leviathan by economic historian Robert Higgs that he wrote in 1987. And he provides an explanation for the rise of big government in the United States, right? So Crisis and Leviathan is an explanation of how every time there has been a crisis in the US, politicians have used these as opportunities to increase the size of the government. Okay, when I say the increase in the size of the government, one explanation, one way to look at it is increase in the share of government expenditure in the GDP, right? Another way to look at it is the number of controls it has in the economy, right? You don't necessarily have to quantify them as such, but there is a broader picture, right? So in taking the case of the United States, in early 1800s in the US, you could buy from any place and sell it at any place. There were no taxes, there were no regulations that you could not start a company, you could not start a business. But now if you look, you need to pay taxes if you need to register your business and all of that, right? So this is an increase in the regulations that come about. So why is this the case? Which is every time there's a crisis, right? People want politicians to do something about it, right? So a crisis could be something like the COVID virus, the pandemic as well, right? Because of the uncertainty, people want the government to take an action there, right? And the government takes an action, right? And what did it lead to? It led to the lockdown, which is an increase in the size of the government, right? The government controlled an increasing part of our lives, right? Again, this is not a judgment of whether that's good or bad, but in times of crisis, this happens. So when we had the global financial crisis, what was the solution? The government taking a bigger role, right? So all of these things. But here's why, as I was reading this book, it struck me that in 1991, the opposite happened. There was a crisis. The politicians could have increased the size of the government because they benefit from it, right? They get more power, they get more opportunities to make money, for good or bad. They get more opportunities to impact change, right? The way they see it. But they chose to let go of their powers. Why? Right? So that's a question. And it goes against the prediction of Higgs theory, right? According to Higgs theory, you would expect us increase in the size of the government. That did not happen. So even in India, right, Nehru, again influenced by Fabian socialism, he provided the ideological vision for the planning commission. But given all of these ideas as well, again, even in the emergency period, it was a government created crisis, but it led to the increase in the size of the government, right? Political emergency that we had in the 1970s. So again, idea here is that the ideology carried by politicians has an impact on what policy decisions they choose. So, for the political elites, ideologies can work in two ways, right? One is a lever in the sense that they use it to cause a policy change, right? So it's used as a tool that makes it, during a crisis, it becomes easier if you're using ideology to increase the size of the government, right? So that's using it as a lever. But the second way that Higgs talks about it is to think of it as a straitjacket. A straitjacket is something that constrains you, right? So not just as a lever that you can use to get something done, but ideology is also something that can stop you from doing something, right? So even if you look at the political economy, if the people, the voters, did not want markets or economic growth, then even the politicians would not have been able to implement these, right? So there is that straitjacket feeling as well. In the 1960s, maybe it would not have been politically feasible to implement these reforms, right? Because people did not want them, right? People would not have voted for them. So ideology here, in a sense, represents a set of constraints faced by political elites, and as these constraints relax, then policy decisions which were previously impossible become possible, right? So if people were to start believing more in liberal ideas, right? And here I mean necessarily economically liberal ideas, that it's okay if the state does not increase, right? We don't want more controls. If that's what people start believing, then it becomes possible for the state for the political elites to now implement these policies. So the 1991 balance of payments crisis, of course, represented such an economic emergency for India, right? And by itself, the crisis was arguably necessary. Why was it necessary? Because people had, because one, there had to be some momentum for change that was required, right? And that momentum for change was given by the crisis itself. But like we discussed, that the direction is also important. Why is it that it went in the direction of less control than more control? And here's where ideology becomes important. So Manmohan Singh, in his 1991 budget speech, this is how he ends his budget speech. He says, quoting Victor Hugo, he says, "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." Right? So the person who is most credited with implementing these reforms, he himself is talking about the role of ideas in the reforms that were being carried out, right? So there is, and it's interesting then why this was missed as an explanation, right? Because if the person who's enacting these reforms themselves is in some sense admitting it. But there are reasons why it's not so straightforward to infer just from this. Okay, but let's first look at an ideology-less liberalization, right? So some questions, which is, but how specifically did ideology factor into the 1991 reforms? So in India, really liberal ideologies have never had an influence, right? So we had the Swatantra Party that was active in the 1950s and 1960s. It was actually the strongest contender to the Congress Party at one point of time when Indira Gandhi had come to power after the death of Nehru, right? But when I say it was the strongest party after Congress, it still was majorly weak, right? Congress was the dominant, like it had a majority and more than that in the parliament. So these ideologies never, and it died down after 1960s. We don't even know Swatantra Party today. Swatantra Party was a liberal party, so politically, economically, and personally. But even in 1991 liberalization, you don't see like liberal ideologies themselves playing a role. So again, if you listen to what Rakesh Mohan had to say, again, Rakesh Mohan was a bureaucrat who was involved during the 1991 reforms, and he admits that there was no ideological break. So again, Rakesh Mohan, in the same speech later, he writes, however innocuous these reforms might seem today, they were revolutionary in 1991. Years of ideological baggage was being shed, right? And it seemed that Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi were being repudiated, right? So again, Rakesh Mohan identifies that there was no strong ideological break in 1991, right? That hey, until now we believed in socialist ideas, now we believe in liberal ideas, right? Like free market capitalist ideas. No, right? But you can still recognize that over time, people did not believe in socialist ideas anymore, right? Which is not to say that they became very strongly attracted to liberal ideas and free market ideas themselves, but there was an ideological change that was happening. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, again, the one who wrote the M document and was the Commerce Secretary, he wrote in 1994, just a couple years after the reforms, and actually during, because like I said, it was the reforms were still happening, right? So this was again in the middle of the reforms. He wrote that the past 10 years have seen a remarkable convergence of views among all segments of society on what is good for development, right? And he says that this convergence was clearly influenced by a shift in intellectual opinion away from earlier structuralist view of development, right? So again, people who are involved in the reforms themselves are talking about a convergence of views, are talking about a change in the views, right? And change in the views away from a structuralist view. A structuralist view here is a more controlled planning view of how an economy is supposed to be shaped, right? This is a clipping from a Times of India article. I will the highlighted part I will read out to you. This is from July 1991. The highlighted part says his reforms, his is Narasimha Rao, his reforms should aim to eliminate the waste, inefficiency, and free lunches to favored lobbies that have proliferated supposedly in the name of socialism. Right? Now, here again, of course, there's a recognition that there are interest groups, right? So there are people who are enjoying, that are lobbying, that are getting free lunches, but there's also the recognition that this was happening in the name of socialism, right? So when small industries were asking for protection, when also large industries were asking for protection from foreign competition, they were lobbying, right? But what was their argument? This is, we are a socialist country, right? The government should control this. The government should decide how we are supposed to produce. We can't leave it up to the markets, right? And this is the businessmen saying it, right? They're saying we can't leave it up to the markets. Why would the businessmen say that, right? Because markets are not the businesses themselves, like these businesses themselves, but the potential entrants who will dislodge their positions. So again, there is an interest group explanation that's involved here, but that by itself is not all of it, right? The interest group explanation was, it came out through ideological baggage and lens. So India's early socialist ideologies had been losing steam since the 1980s, and this is recognized in the academia even on what we would consider the left, right? So Atul Kohli, when he's writing in 2012, he's talking about how the 1980s period, it's characterized by a slow but steady abandonment of socialism for a more pro-business political economy, right? So now this is a criticism, right? I mean, in the sense that Atul Kohli wants to say that that's a bad change that's happening, that we're moving away from socialism and towards pro-business. And 1990s were actually pro-markets than pro-business. That is Atul Kohli's point. But again, the point that this is not about saying that it was good that we moved away or bad that we moved away, but to recognize that there was a movement in terms of the ideology and the philosophy that the political elite specifically believed in. Okay, so now we come to after this setting, we now look at particular changes, right? So in the 1980s, in the second half of the 1980s, when Rajiv Gandhi was the prime minister, we already started seeing some degree of reforms, right? Some industries had gotten delicensed. Imports to some extent had become easier. In 1985, we had the M. Narasimhan Committee, which recommended very strong changes in the MRTP Act to restrict the number of industries that are in the list where you need to seek government permission to start a business. It recommended industrial delicensing, that you remove away with licensing, and these are ideas that are there in 1985, right? So this happened under the Rajiv Gandhi administration. Now why? This is Jagdish Bhagwati recognizes that compared to Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi was less beholden to older Fabian socialist ideas, right? Rajiv Gandhi recognized the importance of technology, and because technology adapts so quickly, you need markets to respond at that pace, right? The bureaucratic framework just does not. And he was more cognizant of the costs imposed by state intervention in the economy. And in late 1980s, Jagdish Bhagwati recounts that more individuals were interested in talking about deregulation and were keen on reforms, right? So just more people now started talking and recognizing that this is the direction that we need to go in, right? Like what we had earlier is not working. We need something different. Again, like I mentioned, it was not just the politicians, right, but other thinkers. Of course, these ideas, on one sense, came from the academia, right? Trade policy reform that happened is largely credited to Jagdish Bhagwati's work on liberalization of trade, right? And this work was in the 1970s, right? But these ideas were there, right? Again, Montek Singh Ahluwalia authored the M document in 1990, which is before the reforms. There was also the recognition that China's economic transformation and a little bit later also like the East Asian tigers who were gaining pace. Um, there's sort of a little bit of India's pride being hurt here, which is India is this great nation, right? And that's not like in a nationalist sense, but we are a pretty capable nation, right? Why is it that countries like China and East Asia are able to make such great strides in their economic growth, but we are left behind, right? So there's also that recognition that's coming in from the outside. And so in some socialist ideas, they started begin losing their sway in all levels of the government. So it was not like just at the top, it's just the politicians. No, there were bureaucrats at multiple levels who were operating. There were people outside this. There were public intellectuals, right? The richer middle class, because they were now traveling to other countries. They were sending their students out to other countries. So for instance, Shashi Tharoor himself, at that point he was not as big of a politician, but he was a student, right, in the 1980s. And to travel to the US, he needed, because currency was very highly controlled, he wouldn't get more than a certain amount of dollars, and he needed to go to the RBI, get permission from the RBI as a student to go outside to study, right? There were some documents that needed approval. And only a limited amount of currency would be granted to you as a student, right? And now they started recognizing the cost of this. If you take that money and you go to the US and you live in the US, you see there's no such thing. Right? There is no control, but there is such great deal of richness that's there in the country, right? Such lavishness. There has to be something about the kind of policies that are in place, right? And they started recognizing that. Now, to conclude, to describe India as a stronghold for classical liberalism is inaccurate, right? Even today, it's not like India is very close to having classical liberal leaders, and we look at liberal ideas which are neither on the left nor on the right, right? So we have all kinds of liberty. We don't really have any political parties or any ideological frameworks that talk about it this way in the public discourse. But this does not mean that India hasn't undergone a significant ideological change in the last 40 years, right? The kind of ideas that were around in the public discourse and 40 years ago in the 1980s, those are not the same. Actually through 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, those are not the same ideas that are in public discourse today, right? And we have argued that a decline in the prominence of socialism, what it did is it loosened the constraints for the political elites, and that along with the 1991 created the scope for liberalization, right? So I talked about the direction. The direction is because of the ideology, right? So the timing is explained by the crisis, right? But the direction is explained by ideological change, is what we're saying. And why does this research question matter, right? It's not just something about India, but in the long term we see that the size of the governments increases everywhere in the world, right, over time. That's just with economic growth. There are a bunch of laws out there. There's something called the Wagner's law and other stuff, which talks about how with economic growth you will have an increase in the size of the government. But there are some notable instances of liberalization, and we think we can explain that, right? And the very interesting case is Argentina last year, towards the end of 2023, the current prime minister, right? he is a self-admittedly a libertarian, right? So what was his agenda? His agenda, like his research program, was that we will cut away most government ministries. We'll just chop them away. So no more Ministry of Sports, no more Ministry of Culture, right? That is not the role of the government. The role of the government is strictly security, to provide peace, to provide you protection from violence, to uphold contracts and stuff like that, right? And to um, reduce government printing of money, to reduce inflation. But anyhow, the point is that even if we look at more recently, there have been instances where countries in crisis, like Argentina currently, um, we see that ideological change can play a role in reducing the size of the government. So yeah, you could look at other countries as well. China, Vietnam, the 1980s transformation that happened in China, the liberalization of Vietnam itself. Maybe there is an ideological explanation that is going on here, right? So the scope of the government can be explained not just by ideological change explains not just an increase in the size of the government, but also, we believe, a decrease in the size of the government. So what do we plan to do in terms of research? We've already, along with the Marketers Center, we've recorded oral histories with people involved in the reforms, right? So these are like 10 to 20-hour long oral histories that have been recorded, with people like Rakesh Mohan, Chidambaram, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. We'll also be interviewing Manmohan Singh soon if his health improves. But we have oral histories with all of these people that we plan to use, right? Why are oral histories important? I was talking to Josh Feldman. Josh Feldman was an IMF representative to India, and I was talking to him, and he said he has this interesting explanation, and it's his explanation, not I wouldn't claim it to be mine. But he said that there was also this component of saving face, right? That was happening, which is in 1980s and 1990s, everyone realized that this is not working, but nobody wanted to admit it, right? You don't want to go out and admit that, hey, what we've done until now is wrong, right? Because it's also the same party. It was the Congress, right? That had been bringing this, and there were various factions within Congress and all of that. But there's this component of saving face. But oral histories can give insights to us today, because it allows people to recount these experiences much later. And today they don't have to care about their political interests, right? Most of these are not politicians anymore, except Chidambaram. Yeah. Um, Okay, anyway, that's one part of a research that we want to do. The other is we want to analyze government committee reports from 1960s through 1990s, right? So this research is something I'm engaged in right now, which is 1960s. You look at the government reports, to look at industrial licensing, to look at trade policy. They identify the same problems. They identify that government controls have led to a stagnation in the economy. But what is their solution? We need better control, not less control. We need better control. We need better licensing systems. We need a better rationalization of tariffs, right? But the same reports, if you look at the reports, the Abid Hussain committee report or the Narsimhan committee report, the Sen Gupta committee report in the 1980s, they again identify the same problems, that government licensing systems and all of these led to these problems. But this time the solution is less control, right? So we want to go back and look at these reports themselves, see what the reports have to tell us about a change in ideology. And a third is we want to also do an analysis of newspapers, because newspapers carry ideas, right? At this moment we are restricting ourselves to English newspapers, although at that point of time it was still a minority of the population. But what were the analysis of the articles in newspapers? And this is to some extent already be done by this political economist Nimi Shadia. And he has found that if you look at how the rupee devaluation that happened in 1966 versus 1991, what was the public opinion about it, right? And in 1966, public rupee devaluation was considered bad. In 1991, it was considered not so bad, right? This is a necessary reform. And finally, we want to explore frameworks of ideological and political entrepreneurship, which might explain the policy change. In the sense that, again, you have to recognize that P.V. Narasimha Rao, he was in a unstable coalition government, right? He did not have a majority government. in such a situation, how did these reforms go through, right? And it was not just that he was fighting against other political parties, but he was fighting within the Indian National Congress, right? There were a lot of Indian National Congress leaders who still held socialist ideas. So then, how do you sort of tackle? How do you explain that through this? So we believe the answer is political entrepreneurship, right? You have the ideas, but you also need political entrepreneurship to get these ideas through and the reforms through, right? So yes, that's been my talk. Thank you so much. We have okay. I see we have only 5 minutes for question and answers, but I'm available otherwise as well. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Samruddha, for this excellent session. Now we know where your expertise comes from. It's not only just being the research assistant to Shruti Rajgopalan and team at Mercator Center and being a Prometheus Fellow and also being a Bastard Fellow. You have been doing great research and it's been great to see. I would like to invite now Professor Abhay to please give some parting words. And I would also like to invite him to felicitate Samruddha Surana with the book.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm not sitting there in the capacity of your formal teacher. I listened to his speech intensely as a student. No, I kept quiet after he solicited questions because I have many uh, doubts, queries, which I think I will share with you in person later. There are only 3 points that are I think everybody should at least we should dwell upon them. The first is this whole idea of Fabian socialism. The adoption of Fabian socialism, was it a necessary compromise emerging out of a very strong tussle within the Congress party, where the interest of the prevalent, strong private corporates, they were not comparable to the corporates that we have today. But the business houses, which was represented by Sardar Patel within the Congress party, which would have definitely opposed any direct transition to complete socialism, as we understand it. So, the philosophy of Fabian socialism, which emphasizes gradualism, that ultimately the society will reach a socialistic form of organization where all the major factors of production would be under the state control. However, that drive will not be through revolution, it will be through evolution. So, was it? This is my only hunch that because there was a very strong contender or a protector of private initiative in the form of Mr. Sardar Patel, and these two were towering personalities. So, was it a very practical, pragmatic compromise arrived at by Mr. Nehru that ultimately the 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 structure that we would like to have is of socialistic form of society, but looking at the Indian psyche and the composition of the Indian market in whichever way it existed then, that jump is not possible, perhaps politically, even I don't know, even administratively. This is point one. Two, has it then therefore reflected in the kind of planning model that we adopted? See, you mentioned settled planning, but I am now reminded of see once on 14th August 2014 when Mr. Modi announced from the ramparts of the Red Fort that planning commission will be abolished. There was a beautiful article by Dr. D.M. Naksali in EPW, and his argument was that yes, you may dislike the organization called planning commission, but does that mean that the idea of planning itself has become irrelevant? These two are different things. There he makes a point which I found little bit, I don't know how you will reconcile it. See, he emphasized one thing that the kind of planning that we adopted was never a totalitarian planning as was practiced in USSR or all the socialist countries of those era. We adopted a planning model which was indicative. because we had a very strong, see, these two things go hand in hand. The mixed economy, the structure of economy being a mixed economy, with whatever private sector existed therein, and the need for some kind of a equitable distribution of access and opportunities. So the model that we adopted was essentially that of an indicative planning, not the totalitarian planning as was practiced in USSR. So whether do we have to also recognize this fact that the planning and the idea of Fabian socialism fitted very well into the political dynamics existing within the Congress party at large in that during that era. The third point, which I think is you mentioned it. See, I forget the name, but if it is, if I'm correct, Rob Jenkins has used this phrase, reforms by stealth, and this is exactly the point that you were making, and that his argument is that any kind of change is generally resisted by existing stakeholders because there's a beautiful balancing of interests among different stakeholders. So any major reform, is fundamental reform, he said that, and you mentioned it, the American, but he makes his point very strongly in his book. I think the name of the book itself is Reforms by Stealth, or whether I'm getting confused. But he uses this phrase, and this is what he says that explains perhaps the genesis of political entrepreneurship exhibited by Mr. Rao. This is the fourth point, and that last point. See, I really do not know how to put it. But again, if I remember correctly, there's a book by excellent book by a French researcher. His PhD thesis was published. It's a recent. If I don't know, it's Bentley, if I am correct. See, he makes this point that if we look at the economical ideas of the Congress Party post 1980, that is 11 years before 1991 major leap forward. His argument is that after emergency, when Mrs. Gandhi retained power, when she regained power, there was a very strong realization and recognition and appreciation within the Congress Party and particularly among the advisors of the Prime Minister that during that whole period of later part of 1970s, there was a very vibrant, although numerically small, but a very vibrant aspirational middle class, which was largely emerging in most of the large metros within the country. So the entire focus of the Congress Party ideology, so to say, or policies, Garibi Hatao, 20-point program, so on and so forth, started or required some shift away from the traditional focus, and that is how his argument is that initial reforms or initial signs of change in the mindset was reflected the day Mrs. Gandhi came to power in 1980, and the reason being emergence of the middle class. And there is one small factor to corroborate this. See, this is very interesting. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little more time. Yeah, see, China began reforms in 1978, and you will find that it is really intriguing that Tiananmen happened in 1989, 11 years after the reforms. Now, unfortunately, that periodical has been now, the journal is closed, that Far Eastern Economic Review. There was a beautiful article in Far Eastern Economic Review which argued that why there was an upsurge among students, particularly after 11 years of reforms. The argument was that this is exactly what you were saying, the whole balance among stakeholders with rising proportion of youth in the total population, which had tasted fruits of reforms. They were now aching for more freedom politically. So what the article was trying to suggest is that this is some kind of a structural mismatch. That on the economic front you have liberalism. So at least even if it is a state-led capitalism, there are SEZs. you see that market forces are allowed to operate freely in certain sections of the society, in certain areas, geographical areas of the country, but the overall polity is strongly governed by the authoritarian rule of the Communist Party. So this structural struggle, that economic liberalism and political authoritarianism. So the revolt of Tiananmen essentially was a very uh, aggressive response of the suppressed aspirations of the new youth or new middle class which emerged in China as a fallout of whatever reforms were implemented. So I think this whole, and I think see, the first thing is, I should have mentioned it in the outset. Your presentation was excellent, and I think that this is now a correct time that we have now that this 1991 is now almost 35, 34 years behind us. So we can now take a more dispassionate view of the factors, the forces, the compulsions of those years or times. Now, the last point I just want to make is, see, what I think is, because you mentioned those three I's, the interests, ideas, and institutions. See, I'm reminded of only other, this is also a historical uh, course of events. See, Mrs. Gandhi resorted to a very aggressive form of socialism towards end of 1960s, beginning with nationalization of banks and then abolition of private purses. I don't think that it was a very strong commitment to the revival of idea of socialism as postulated by her father. It was more of a political exigency because there was a strong revolt within the party challenging her leadership. So to divert, this is what I call, this is the same logic Rob Jenkins says that reforms by stealth. There, Mrs. Gandhi used the idea of socialism to silence its intra-party opponents by taking a very historic and some kind of a heroic action of nationalizing banks and cancelling or abolishing private purses. I don't think that it has anything to do with very strongly with idea. It is always, I suppose, that ideas and interests and some kind of an exchange between these two supported with opportune time. I think this has been the course of any kind of reform. At least that is my understanding. That has happened in our country. But it is a fantastic area and an extremely. It was a very enriching deliberation from you, and I wish you all the best. Okay, and
Thank
thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much. Thank you.